Hello again and welcome back to another video, and today we are looking at a scenario where Russia had won World War I. Of course, they were part of the Allied faction, and they were working together with partners such as the French and the British against the German Empire. In this scenario, we're going to assume that for some reason or another, which is not something I'm going to be doing in this video, the Russians managed to come out of this war with absolutely everything they could have had. They could have possibly wanted, possibly a bit more influence in Germany or a puppet state in the Balkans. But for the Tsar, this is the most perfect scenario that could have come out of this war. We're going to assume that for a multitude of reasons, the Soviets are just completely unable to win the Civil War. Perhaps some of their most important members are killed/assassinated. The war goes significantly better, so the Russian people aren't as angry. This is not a video about how this would happen. If you want to see that, I can make a separate video about that. To do that, we would have to go back, most likely to the Japanese-Russian War, possibly even further, and have them do better in even further back wars like the Crimean War to set them up for victory. This is just a what if they did, what if nothing else changed, and they for some reason got everything they could have wanted land-wise from the First World War. Of course, if we immediately compare this with what they started with, they have managed to gain a good amount of land over here in Europe and over here in the Ottomans. It's not the most massive land expansion, but it is still a good amount of land. And if you compare it to what the Soviets had at the end of the war in our timeline, this Russia is doing amazing. This black line that I'm drawing right now is not perfect, but it is about what the Soviet border looked like. So this Russian Empire is significantly larger. And a few other effects of this happening would be if Russia did significantly better, perhaps Germany would have surrendered sooner. This may have caused France to be confident enough to take a bit more land, much more confident in their own ability. But it also would have led to one very, very important thing, and that is that war reparations on the German Empire would be very minimal. We would also see larger Austria and a much larger Hungary. The larger Austria is simply because Italy did not join this, or at least was not in this war very much before the war ended. Obviously, the war ended sooner. Russia did well. The Ottoman War for Independence just didn't win. They could not win if the Russians got involved. The British had to fight in the Middle East. This is their homeland. This is the French homeland. And both of them didn't really care. The only nation that truly fought the Ottomans hard in the Turkish War for Independence, which wasn't really for independence, but more so to not get carved up by other powers, is Greece. But in this scenario, Russia, not wanting to give up all of these lands, would fight against the Turks and would ensure the Turkish failure in this war. We also see an independent Kurdistan under heavy British influence, a smaller French Syria, and French full control of the Saarland and influence over the Rhineland. Once again, though, France would not have to directly occupy this because there are no war reparations that need to be paid. Along with this, the Russian Empire would be in a significantly stronger position, mainly because they can now use ports such as Sevastopol and much more easily get out into the Mediterranean without really having to worry about a Turkish threat. Although they are still trapped in the Mediterranean, and although they have increased their Baltic coastline, it is still very, very difficult for them to get out into the world. This will be an ongoing problem as their eastern ports are simply not large or powerful enough to supply the Russian nation. But if we assume that a few other things also went well for them, they are in a decent situation. They have the largest mainland European population, and at this point they are the second largest empire in the world, if you exclude India from the British Empire having a larger population than the British Empire. They may not be in the most stable position, but let's start off by slightly helping with that. To do so, they will create Russian autonomous states. There will be a Polish state, a Finnish state, and an Armenian state to begin with. The Armenians were given this as a buffer state between themselves and Turkey, who was very much so militarizing, hoping to regain even more territories. Perhaps not directly annexing Russian territories, but these lands right here, Turkey would really like to have those back, and Russia needs to prepare for war, and having a territory right on the border that would really not like to be a part of you is not a good idea. Ukraine was also a major contender for being given autonomy, but the Russians at this point wanted to integrate Ukraine, not give it more autonomy, in order to secure it into the future, as they are not even sure if they will be able to hold Poland or Finland for an extended period of time. They most definitely do not want to lose Ukraine, as that would be absolutely devastating. Another interesting side effect I would like to talk about is Hungary. In our timeline, they lost a lot more land than this, perhaps some to Serbia, a lot more to Romania, and some to Slovakia. Basically, in this timeline, they are significantly larger. They still have lost very many territories in northern Serbia, which still has a large Hungarian minority. In Romania, Burgenland, of course, they have still lost land, but it is nowhere near as much as they did in our timeline. This is because one of the main reasons for them losing all of that land was a communist revolution that happened in the nation at the time of the peace conference, which made the West very, very anti-Hungarian, allowing the Romanians and the Yugoslavs to take all the land that they wanted. Along with this, a Czechoslovakian, Romanian, Yugoslavian coalition, mainly Romanian, Czechoslovakian coalition, destroyed them, taking Slovakia and Transylvania from them. In this scenario, it is just Czechia. They do still control some Slovene majority areas, and parts of northern Hungary are also Slovene majority, but the rest are in Russia, and defeating the Russians is absolutely impossible, so these smaller Slovene populations may be integrated into the Poles, the Czechs, or the Hungarians. What would change? Obviously, a lot of things have changed in this world. Russia is now most likely the largest threat in the world. Italy is even more pissed off, as Libya is smaller. They did not get Jubaland. They didn't even get all of southern Tyrol, with Austria gaining some parts of the north, keeping some parts of the north. And they were unable to get Dalmatia or even any port cities that are majorly Italian. The French are fairly happy with this. They have regained Alsace-Lorraine, which was their main goal. They have also taken the Saarland, which is planned on being returned to Germany eventually. But for now, the Saarland is under French full control, along with some surrounding regions, to ensure that Germany cannot build back up too quickly. We also see the situation in Germany being extremely different. In our timeline, the war operations placed on them were absurd. And although in this world they have lost slightly more land because of the Russians taking East Prussia, it would not be as devastating as you may expect, since the war operations being lifted would lead to major parties, especially the most noticeable, the Nazis, being far weaker, as they would be able to integrate much easier into the new world. They would also be given many more opportunities as an actual nation, as the Western powers were not embarrassed over and over again, as they nearly lost Paris to a German invasion of northern France. Obviously, if the Russians had performed better, the Germans would have had to send more divisions over to the Russian border, leading to a lesser, still devastating, but lesser invasion of France, which caused Germany to be less hated. And the world has now also lost the largest communist state, and the one who really championed the form of government that is communism to the entire world. Communists would still be fairly angry with the Russian Tsar, but if the Tsar instead chose to ally himself with some moderates or some further democratic parties, he could most likely stay in power, not even as a constitutional monarch, but still with a large amount of power, just giving up some strength to a national assembly of sorts. He would also most likely be forced to give up even more rights to the Polish government, as Poland is looking to further itself from Russia and create its own government. This Russia would be heavily feared in this world. But you know what? Let's actually start off with the Turkish War for Independence, or should I say the second one. In this war, Turkey will go to war with Greece and with Russia, technically just with Greece, but Russia, fearing for their own lands, would join into the war against the Turks. They would also declare war on Kurdistan, which would lead the UK to fully back the Russians on this. The Turks will obviously not win this war, but they will most likely do better than you would have expected. They will swiftly capture most of their coast from the Greeks and push up north into some Russian-controlled territories. In Istanbul, however, the Russians and Greeks would pose a very powerful defense, leading to Turkey being unable to capture the city. In Kurdistan, they would start a mass invasion, but it would still not be enough to capitulate it, as the UK is now considering fully joining in on this war, despite Turkey not actually declaring war on them. The Turks have also started a push into Greater Armenia, which, after the Armenian genocide, is not as Armenian as you may think. The Russians are still not in a very stable position, and a large portion of their army is stationed near Japan, preparing perhaps for the devastation of the country, near Germany for any German threat. And a lot of it is being spent quelling rebellions all across the nation, as the Turks in Central Asia are not very happy with this war. The Poles are not very happy with this war. The Finns are not very happy with this war. The Cossacks are not very happy with this war. The Ukrainians are not very happy with this war. Nobody truly wants to aid in this. Turkey would eventually be forced to compromise, as they just simply could not win this war in the long term. Russian forces are now starting to arrive in bulk, and after the building of a new, limited but still powerful railway that is aiding in Russian supply, and the increase of investment into Russian logistics, Russian forces were pushing back Turkish independence fighters. Of course, the brilliant mind of Ataturk could still hold and could push most likely even further, but eventually a peace treaty would be reached. The Turks would regain many of their lands, but the Russians would still be allowed some control on the Anatolian Peninsula to control the Bosporus going into the future. The Turks were not able to capture Istanbul, and thus were not able to capture control of the Bosporus, most likely ever again. The Greeks would lose their Anatolian possessions, but they would keep Thrace, which would still be a major increase from what they got in our timeline. The Turks would expand significantly into Russian-dominated Turkish regions, and they would also annex all of Kurdistan, leading to a smaller Turkey than in our timeline, but still a Turkey that has expanded massively from what the treaty had originally stipulated. We would also see that this Turkey, who had nearly been on the brink of war with the UK, would have worse than terrible relations with the United Kingdom. A possible war could even erupt in the future, as the UK is demanding that Turkey retreat from Kurdistan, but eventually a deal is made, in which a smaller Kurdistan is added directly into British Iraq, whilst the Kurdish minority regions are allowed to expand into northern Iraq itself. A population transfer would then take place across the border, in which Kurds were pushed into this British mandate of Kurdistan, and Turks flocked into the Kurdish regions of Turkey, hoping for free land and possibly even some stuff that the Kurds may have left over. This Turkish war for independence did not go as well as anybody was really hoping. Nobody is happy. The Greeks lost land, the Russians lost land, the Turks did not gain all the land that they wanted. The British may have lost some influence, but if Turkey agrees to open up their coast, perhaps some more favorable negotiations with the British, they may be allowed to survive. Along with this, they would start pushing for the return of territories in Syria to them. Eventually, the French would concede Haiti, but they would go no further, and this is where Turkey would stay for a very, very long time, until eventually Russian decline and British decline would ramp up even further. Now remove that, and the Greeks as well would stay out of Russian affairs as Russia starts to focus further and further on the Balkans. They already have very many allies here in Yugoslavia who they backed on most of their concerns. And soon enough, a Russian sphere in the Balkans would be set up, as in Bulgaria, the government really isn't happy about how the war went. They lost their coast along the Mediterranean, leaving them with only the Black Sea, meaning they are now reliant on Russia to allow their goods into the greater world market. This is not particularly good for the Bulgarians, as they are still mad at the Russians for backing nations against them during World War I. This is still less than 20 years after, and not much has happened yet. Diplomatically, though, many things have changed. In Italy, Mussolini is rising to power very quickly, and with Italy gaining even less lands, Italian revanchism would be through the roof. They would want to get revenge. They would want to kill all the people they thought had wronged them. I've no doubt eventually the fascists would take control of Italy and possibly even start a war in the Balkans against the Russians. That I cannot tell you for sure, because this Russian government is struggling. They may have won the war, but they are still struggling significantly. Once again, don't know how that happened, but for some reason it did, and the Russians are now going to be forced to give up many lands to a now independent Polish state. This Polish state would not be independent and instead be heavily under Russian influence, but it would still be technically an independent state free of Russian rules. The Russians would not really want this, but seeing as a compromise was made, in which Poland gave up their claims to all of these territories, the Russians were forced to agree, and they still have major influence in this nation, which does not have claims on very many more territories, and is fairly happy with where it is, not taking more land from Russia, which is mainly Ukrainian or mainly German. The Germans at this point would also go one of three ways. They could go democratic, honestly. In real life, they were mad at the Allied powers. The Allied powers had crippled them, destroyed their economy, blamed the entire war on them when they had not even started it. It was absolutely horrible for all sides, and the Germans were destroyed. In this timeline, they have still lost a lot of land, and they still had some more reparations to pay, but the German economy could recover much quicker. And if a democratic regime does come into power, well, and I see the return of the Saarland happening very, very soon. This would be in an effort to push Germany away from the Russians and towards the British and the French. They would even start to somewhat allow the Germans to closer their ties to Austria. They would still not be allowed to unite, but their relations would start to improve as Austria also moves into this bloc, possibly getting closer and closer to uniting with Germany, although I do not know if they would allow that, even if Germany was aligned with the West, as that would make them very, very powerful on the European stage. Still, a powerful Germany to stop the Russians from expanding into Western Europe could be very beneficial. At this point, the Hungarians and the Romanians, though, have had a dispute for very, very long. The Romanians say that they were not given enough in the peace treaty and that their border should be pushed further, and the Hungarians are saying that there are still many Hungarians' lands in Romania, and that those should be given back to them. This is about where the border dispute stands, and Russia is going to have to make a choice between Hungary and Romania. Eventually, they decide to back neither side and instead back quite the odd choice, Bulgaria. They join in on the Hungarian side, which does improve Russian-Hungarian relations, and I'm not going to map out the whole war, but by the end of it, Bulgaria has gained southern Dobruja and surrounding territories. The Russians have been given a small amount of the Romanian coast and a small amount in the north of land. Meanwhile, the Hungarians have stripped away many Romanian possessions, expanding themselves back into almost all of Transylvania, although some regions were by now so undeniably Romanian that the Russians pushed to keep them under Romanian rule. This region would also become very, very much so Russian aligned, as it is not a Russian puppet, but instead a closely aligned government with the Russians. The Bulgarians would also start to improve relations with Russia, and despite the fact that Yugoslavia and Bulgaria had been at war 30 years ago, which is not how much time has gone by, but close enough, the Yugoslavians would also start to drift into the Russian sphere. This would very heavily worry the West, as the Russians were pushing very, very deep. But really, what can they do, really? I mean, going to war with the Russians at this point was not a good idea. They have the largest military. They are still not nearly as modernized, and they would most definitely take more casualties and be hurt significantly more. But a war was still not beneficial for them, or really anybody. At this point, along with that, Italy has begun their invasion of Ethiopia. They will win, but it will not be an easy battle, and it will completely isolate them on the world stage. They have no Germany to turn to. They cannot turn to Russia, as Russia has aligned themselves with Yugoslavia. The West doesn't want them. They hate the way their government has been progressing, and they refuse to give the Italians any free land for barely contributing at all in the war. Italy starts to consider direct war, and I see that as a very high possibility. There are multiple ways it could happen, perhaps an Italian rebellion in the south for the Democrats or monarchists, perhaps some kind of thing in the north in areas like Venice, which had been being completely exploited of their wealth to aid in the greater Italian goal. Or perhaps the Western powers in Italy end up at war with Italian troops in North Africa, or Italian troops in Somaliland. There is no real way of knowing how it would start, but by the end of the war, Italy would be crushed. Austria would be expanded southward, Yugoslavia would be granted Istria, and Italy would really not lose an absurd amount of land, but they would not be as powerful anymore. In Africa, they are allowed to keep Libya, but Italian East Africa is going to be divided by the British and the French. The French set up basically Ethiopia, taking a massive amount of the north. Meanwhile, the British take the south to connect up their colonies, and the very far north to basically encircle Ethiopia between the two powers and ensure that they can never grow again. From there, the British would set up a puppet in Ethiopia, completely under their thumb, but still technically independent, similar to what Poland is with Russia, completely under British control, but technically independent. This would also be the war in which Germany would finally be allowed to unite once more, with Greater Austria and the German Republic uniting into the Greater German Realm. This would be a questionable choice by the Allied powers, but they saw it as the best option, as this new powerful Germany, which had now been setting up influence in Czechoslovakia and allying itself with Hungary, is a powerful bloc and a massive obstacle in the way of Russia and European domination. Russia would attempt to refocus on Asia by supporting many rebellions in China. By the end of the warlord period, China would be at war with Japan. I'm not going to go much further, but basically by the end of it, Russia and Japan go to war. China is successful, but China does not unite in the way you might think. Manchuria becomes a Russian puppet, with Russia getting, I believe it's Dalian? Yes, as a direct port that they now have to expand their own naval dominance. They also gain a full puppet over Manchuria, not just a influenced state. Perhaps not as close as Poland, but still very, very close. They would also gain all of southern Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands, whilst getting much better relations with the new Japanese government, which was actually put in place by the people instead of the Russians. The Chinese would also be united, but not before the Russians could snatch up Mongolia under their own influence. Tibet would be independent for now, but China would most likely conquer that later on. Russian-Chinese relations are not very good, which may lead to better Chinese-Western relations. The USA would also be a lot less powerful in this world, having not nearly as much influence over Western Europe as they did in our timeline, as Western Europe does not have as many, war debts to pay the US. The US does not have as many troops in Europe, and is not nearly as involved in Europe, as the Second World War was much more contained between Italy and the Western powers. This would lead to a second bloc forming. I'm not going to show exactly how it looks, but it is the French, the British, the Germans, the Italians, Benelux, Norway and Denmark. Greece actually joins this instead of the Russian bloc, along with, of course, all of their African possessions. And honestly, I see a joint invasion of Iran. I doubt the Western powers want direct war with the Russians, but a division of Iran is very, very likely, as it was a fairly popular idea in our own world as well. What would happen to Turkey? Well, they could go either way. Perhaps I doubt they would join the Russians, as they would not want to join anybody who refuses to give them back the city of Istanbul, which is still very much so a Turkish city. But if the British and the French are willing to make some concessions, I could see Turkey joining their side and giving up on most other claims on the Greek nation. I am going to end it here, as it is getting a lot longer. Russia is definitely a power in this world, but they are standing alone against Western Europe. I do think they'll eventually collapse, perhaps slightly larger than in our timeline, as they managed to expand significantly more and for a lot longer. In our world, the Soviet Union did not last for that long, at least not in their final form, which most people know them at. They did control about half of Ukraine, but they did not have the time to integrate it nor the resources. Here, the Russian government would push pan-East Slavism as a whole, and the unity of the Russian peoples, to the point where a decent portion of this empire would be considering themselves Russian or Russian-aligned, pushing significantly into the Baltic states, ending most of their own, independence fights. In Belarus, the Belarusians would not be fully integrated, and in Ukraine, there are still many Russian pockets of Russian speakers, similar to Hungary and Transylvania. There are pockets of Russian speakers in Finland. The Russians have pushed further in destroying the Finnic nation. And in the Caucasus, besides Azerbaijan, it is now nearly fully Russian. In Central Asia, the Russians did not put as much effort, as they saw it as an easy area to quell. But that is still a significantly larger Russia than in our timeline if they ever were to break apart, which would happen eventually. Once again, I am going to end it here, as the video is getting too long, but I do hope you enjoyed. Russia's extremely powerful, maybe not for long. The USA is secluded. Western Europe stands alone, and I will see you all next time. Goodbye.